Good evening, everyone. We left off on page 70. Chapter 4. 2 days ago. Through seemingly endless interrogations and investigations into choices, Curie's team was able to put together that the Diablo were building something, and that they needed the help of Rick Fanning and Joseph Portez to find the right chemical formulas. Greg had discovered deleted files, with remnants on Ted Davidson's computer, that revealed communications between Davidson and Portez about a certain chemical formula. There was another file that showed Davidson's cybernetic access to Fanning's personal library of the alloys he was most proud of, made for exposure to very specific contents. One of these contents happened to be an ingredient used in the treatment of geraniums, which led them to the connection to Wendy Hunter, the florist. Greg and Justin were now off at Davidson's residence looking for any more clues as to what he was up to. Wendy's family had been at the station for a while, demanding answers, and Curie wasn't prepared to give them any just yet. Rick Fanning's wife and Joseph Portez's friends, who had also been called in for questioning, all sat together, making pathetic attempts at casual conversation. Then there was Chuck Butler. Curie still did not understand why Ted Davidson had murdered the boy. Of course, Ted didn't admit it. He was as cold and unflinching as any other Diablo member Curie had ever investigated. Her offers, her attempts to scare him into speaking, her relentless questions, none of it fazed the man. He wouldn't give up his information as long as his boss was alive and able to order the deaths of his family. And he was able to beat the choice test. Sam had been pretty helpful, though. She gave Curie all the information she could, and now Nikki and Sarah were over at the butler's residence, looking for any kind of communication between Chuck and the Diablo. Curie sat across from Ted Davidson yet again in an interrogation room. "Mind if I smoke?" Ted asked, breaking the silence after Curie had asked him a question and had not received an answer. "I do mind. It's illegal to smoke in a non-residential area." "Wasn't aware of that," Ted replied. He put his lighter back in his pocket. "Horrible habit anyway. It'll kill you." Curie didn't respond. Instead, she asked her question again. "How much money was involved in this transaction?" Ted didn't reply. He tapped his foot impatiently under the table. "We have your computer and all your files, Ted," Curie said. "We know what you're planning." She bluffed, yes, but it was effective, especially when she added, "And we have all of the other data that was on your machine as well." "If you knew, you wouldn't be here of all goddamn places," Ted said with a chuckle. If she knew, she'd be out on the streets looking for the bomb, and she wouldn't need to talk to Ted. Curie thought about what he had just said. Then she said, "You're going to jail for murder, possibly going on death row. You've got nothing left except years in solitary confinement until your injection day." He had seen the evidence against him. It was irrefutable. He had killed Chuck Butler. And the fiber placed him at Portez's murder as well, though there was no evidence that he had killed Portez. There was also no evidence of anyone else entering Portez's residence, so it was the power of deductive reasoning. The evidence would probably hold up in a jury, and he would be convicted of a double murder. Ted was also a proven Diablo member. He was not going to walk on this one. All this, Ted knew, but it didn't matter. He was serving the Diablo effectively, and if he gave them up, his name would go down in Diablo history as a snitch. His family would be killed. He was convinced the police would not be able to protect them. "If you help us, Ted, the judge will take that into account." Ted didn't reply. "I'm going to give you one last chance before I walk out that door," Curie said. She might as well have been talking to a door. She stood up, gathered the case file, and walked out without another word as the officer went over to Ted to take him back to his cell. Justin approached her as she exited. "Back so soon?" Curie asked him. "What'd you find?" "Greg and I were able to find a virus scan he ran on his computer. The virus scan saved the files it picked up, and we were able to trace the files right back to their original content, even though a lot of them were deleted. One we found was a secured, encrypted video chat between Davidson and a guy named Peyton. Greg's looking up Peyton's records in the databases now," he said. Curie nodded, and was about to respond when Greg jogged to them from his desk, carrying a writing pad. "I've got results," he said quickly. "Peyton isn't on the choice database because he isn't an American citizen. He's from Eastern Europe. I know Peyton doesn't sound Eastern European. He changed his name. He lost his green card when he failed to pay for over $10,000 worth of traffic fines, and he was deported because of his political immunity. His father's an ambassador to Austria." Curie gave Greg a grim look. Political immunity often meant trouble. In this case, she was sure it did. You said you had results. Anything on criminal databases other than on other countries? He's under suspicion of several crimes, domestically and abroad, including money laundering in California, and he was a suspect in a murder investigation in Kansas. He was under Austria's potential threat to national security list last year. But this is the most interesting. In Saudi Arabia, he was under suspicion of conspiracy with terrorists, never convicted of any of these crimes. Kiri nodded in comprehension, as did Justin. Conspiracy with terrorists. Now Peyton was a national security threat to the United States. They had cause to put Peyton under investigation if he entered the country anyway. This just backed it up. Peyton's someone we need to look into, Kiri said. We need to find out what Davidson was talking to him about. Can you retrieve that video chat, or just the record of it? I can go with Sarah and see if the two of us can reconstruct the video chat from the deleted fragments. It still leaves an imprint on the hard drive, Greg said. Kiri nodded. Sarah's with Nikki, looking for communications at the butler's house. Get a jump start on the file retrieving. Take an officer with you and call Sarah and tell her to join you when she's finished, she ordered, and Greg left to contact Sarah. Kiri turned to Justin. I think you and I need to talk to the families of the victims again. Justin nodded. I agree. So far their stories check out, but it doesn't hurt to double check. I want to see if they noticed anything they didn't think was important, but indicates that any of the victims were communicating with the Diablo. You talk to Mr. Fanning, I'll talk with Wendy Hunter's family. We already know Mr. Portez was in communication with Davidson, and that explains why Davidson wanted him dead. But we need to speak to Sam Butler again, and we need results from Sarah and Nikki. Let's get started. Justin nodded, and they walked together to question the families. About 2 hours later, Kiri's cell phone rang, and she stepped out of the witness room. Lieutenant O'Malley, she answered. Kiri, we've got part of the video chat decrypted, Sarah said on the other line. Kiri nodded. All right, can you bring the results back to the lab? Greg's closing up. We'll be there in 20. What about Chuck's computer? Kiri asked. We found one email he hasn't deleted yet. Communications between him and Davidson. All it said was, understood, I'll be here. It was from yesterday evening. We think that's why he left the alarm off. He was meeting Davidson. Kiri frowned. All right, thanks, Sarah. See you in 20, she said as she snapped the phone closed. She hadn't gotten much out of Wendy Hunter's husband and child. The only suspicious thing either of them had noticed was that Wendy had stayed later at work every day that week. Kiri had called Wendy's coworkers in earlier that week and had said that Wendy was staying later because she had to prepare a very large shipment of geraniums. They already knew what that was all about. The only new information Kiri had, therefore, was that Wendy had been asked to prepare the geraniums ahead of time. Kiri suspected she was killed for the same reason Portez was. She knew something about the Diablo's plan. Kiri went back to the witness room and told the Hunters that they could go back to the waiting area and make themselves as comfortable as possible. Then she exited once more and waited outside the witness room Justin was using until he and Mrs. Fanning exited. Mrs. Fanning went back to the waiting room, and Justin said, Rick said something a few days ago about noticing that someone had hacked into his database. That's it. Kiri nodded. It seems to be a pattern. These Vics were killed because they knew something about the project the Diablo are planning. Chuck Butler's computer showed an email from Davidson last night, and Chuck responded that he understood and that he would be here. I'm assuming here is his house, since he most likely wrote the email from his house. Could have written it from anywhere, but he was killed in his house, Justin said with a nod. So Chuck was meeting Davidson, and that was why the security alarm was off? Kiri nodded grimly. He probably exchanged information and then was killed. He was expecting Davidson. Hans was right about him trusting his guest enough to turn his back for a second. Question is, what were they exchanging? And why would Chuck do that after what happened to his parents? He could have been blackmailed. As far as I know, Nikki's still at the butler's house looking for information. We'll know shortly. Sarah and Greg are on their way back from looking into Davidson's video chat with Peyton. Justin nodded. All right, he said with a sigh. Go get some coffee, take a break. Sarah and Greg won't be here for another 20 minutes. Justin reluctantly complied, saying, You should get something too. I will later, Kiri responded, and he walked away. A little while later, Sarah and Greg came back with a computer in tow. They quickly set the laptop up in the fingerprint lab, put gloves on, and accessed the video chat they had reconstructed. Kiri watched intently as Peyton's face popped up on screen, and the text column appeared, showing what each person was saying. Next week? Davidson asked. Yeah, should be complete. Just go to the slums and look for the flowers. 591. Understood. Any resistance? Not likely. He's a scientist, and he has a child. What is my compensation? 20%. Davidson nodded. Will Tajada... Recommendation? He doesn't know you. But I will put in a good word. I understand you are enthusiastic about his business. Am. There was a long pause, and the screen went black before Davidson's face popped up again. Other transactions? You have been most... Full endorsement, if this is a success. And if he does give you any resistance, show him the picture of his child and leave. Go back the next day, and see if he changed his mind by then. Do not let him leave Chicagoland. Davidson nodded in understanding. Of course not. I'll check in when I have an update. Peyton gave a single nod, and the video chat ended. Kiri stepped back and looked at Greg and Justin. Tajada. That name's familiar. Suddenly it came to her. The Canadian bombings last year. Tajada claimed credit for his cell. Peyton's definitely dealing with terrorists. And they had a scientist building something for them. There was only one thing a terrorist would buy from a gang member, other than perhaps Tank. A weapon. And a large one at that. Suddenly, it made sense. The metal alloy, holding the chemical used to treat geraniums, as well as an ingredient in Tank, they were planning to create a reaction chamber, and it was going to end up being a bomb. Kiri called Justin and Nikki in and assembled the team in the debriefing room. She gave them the evidence they had collected, and they all seemed to make the same connection. A reaction chamber, Justin said. Those two ingredients are explosive, Greg stated as though it were a revelation. He pulled up some stats on his personal computer in front of him and said, Yeah, this confirms it. They're actually on our database. Not a very strong explosion, though. They must have found a way to make it stronger, Sarah said. Kiri nodded. We've got to move. Greg, Justin, start looking for a house number 591 in the inner city Chicago area and search for activity via satellite. They nodded and left. Sarah, Nikki, did you see anything from Chuck Butler's computer other than that he was meeting with Davidson? They shook their heads. No, but we'll keep looking, Nikki said. Good, Kiri said. Let me know what you come up with. We'll read more tomorrow.